Dear friend, it's a great pleasure to present this webinar, which has been organized by George Ikos, my friend and colleague. I start with a correction. I'm not the president of EAPE any longer. I stepped down this month, if this makes any difference. But I'm the president of the Congress that will take place on the 11th to the 13th of March, the Congress of the European Association of Professors Emeriti, to which you are all invited to come, attend, or present. At this stage, you can present only electronic posters, but this is worth it. So if you can write down a summary up to the 31st of March, it would be very much welcome. You can send it to me, or you can send it to ERA Limited, the agency that helps us with this event today.
George, could you remind us the dates? Because it's different from the one I have in mind, the one you said.
You have great imagination, Michelle. It's the 11th to the 13th.
Of June.
Of June, and you said March.
Yes.
You
And
said
you said
March.
March.
March?
Yes, my dear George.
Sorry, it's my mistake.
Okay.
This is
So we are happy because it's exactly the one we had. Thank you so much.
This is past time.
Lack of imagination.
I'm a man of the past, Michelle. So it's the 11th to the 13th of June, and thank you for reminding me. So I want to congratulate George for the choice of the topic, because I think this is a well-balanced topic, since it contains a tribute to Emil Kraepelin, whom I must admit that I admire very much, and also to Lacan, who is the opposite of Kraepelin in orientation, in psychiatric orientation. So Kraepelin is one of the founders of contemporary scientific psychiatry. As you know, he was a protagonist in classification of mental illness, which up to that point was a very vague situation. It did not differentiate between the various categories of illnesses. And I must give credit to Kraepelin for many things, but mainly because he differentiated manic depressive illness from schizophrenia on the basis of longitudinal observation, which is, I think, sine qua non today. So Kraepelin was not static, he was dynamic in the sense that he was following up and he could predict what was happening. He detected that in manic depressive illness, bipolar disorder, we have a phasic course, whilst in schizophrenia we have a gradual course to. At that time, it was not called schizophrenia. Actually, Breuer called it schizophrenia. At that time, it was called dementia praecox. So Kraepelin differentiated dementia praecox from manic depressive illness, bipolar disorder. So he studied the course and the prognosis of illnesses through longitudinal observation. He was not descriptive psychiatrist. He was deeper, much deeper than that. Modern classification systems, of course, depend on the tradition of Kraepelin. They're based on that, ICD-10 and the rest of them. I don't like them, but I like what Kraepelin did, although it's similar. So Kraepelin believed that mental illness is a disease of the brain, and he helped transform psychiatry from a vague, descriptive, and philosophical discipline into a medical grounded clinical science. So he saw the forest, not only the tree. He saw the illness, not only the symptoms. and this is very much to his credit. On the other hand, Lacan interpreted psychoanalytic theory through the lens of language and symbolisms. He has deeply influenced psychoanalytic practice, philosophy, and cultural studies, extending far beyond the boundaries of psychiatry. He influenced many disciplines and many tendencies outside of psychiatry and outside of medicine. Now, we will contrast these two contributions. We can see that the two approaches are complementary rather than antithetical, in my opinion. Kraepelin represented the biological model. Lacan represented the psychoanalytic model. Kraepelin sought diagnostic clarity and predictive validity. Lacan studied the inner logic of psychic life and the meaning of symptoms. So, Kraepelin responded to the question, what? And Lacan responded to the question, how? So, Kraepelin set the framework, and Lacan did the fine-tuning. So, these two very important men complement each other. Before passing on to George Eakos, I would like to mention that George, with Thomas Becker, published online a book which is called Psychiatry After Kraepelin, Ambition, Images, and Practices, Eakos and Thomas Becker, online as PDF. So with this, I have the pleasure of handing over to George Eakos for his introduction. Thank you very much. George Eakos.
George, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for your indefatigable spirit, and energy, which ensured this webinar takes place. Thank you to EAPE, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, History of Psychiatry and Philosophy and Psychiatry Special Interest Groups, the Hellenic Psychiatric Association, and the Speculative Psychiatry group. I would like to share my screen to refer to the book that George has mentioned, because it is immediately relevant. It's funded open access through the generosity of Professor Thomas Burns, Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry in Oxford. And I'm really grateful to Thomas Becker for a dream partnership. And it is the work really of, in large part, of the college special interest groups in history and philosophy, and follows exactly a year from a conference we held, a two-day conference at the RSM, Royal Society of Medicine. You can read every chapter independently, or I would advise to read the book as a whole. You'll get a lot more out of it than if you only read each chapter, or each section can be autonomous, in fact. So, for me, certainly, there is no more important figure in psychiatry than Kraepelin. He is the man that really defined the identity of the specialty in what my colleagues and I have called the long 20th century of psychiatry, from 1899, when he described dementia precox, to today. I think that era of psychiatry has come to an end. Both Kraepelin and Lacan are controversial figures in personal political respects, and we're not going to go through them because time does not allow. And we will benefit a lot more by hearing about their ideas, their work, and how these have interacted with others. It's a great pleasure to hand over to Paul Hoff, who is a dear colleague in our group, The Precision of Images, Emil Kraepelin, Walter Benjamin, and the History of Psychiatry, 1926-2026. He is Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry in Zurich, President of the Central Ethics Committee of the Swiss Academy of Medical Sciences, and with long interest in philosophy, conceptual history of psychiatry, and I understand he's now involved in research on schizophrenia in language. Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, George. And we have two Georges. And may I begin with a little personal remark, because I think that has to be possible in scientific context. Look at this.
Oh,
You know this guy, and you know this book I received from himself. George, thank you very much to my colleague and friend Paul Hoff in February 2012. So we know we didn't work very much together, that's true, but we know each other for a long time. It was always a big pleasure to discuss with you and to stay in contact with you. So that's why I took the freedom to show that book, sorry. But now it's...
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much.
It is a pleasure.
Pleasure.
You know, I'm not an expert, but I'll do my very best to share these files about Kraepelin and Jaspers and Kronfeld. Now, let's see whether that works. Do you see it?
Not yet. Oh, yeah.
Now,
No. George and Dusika, can you mute just in case?
Is everybody able to see that now?
Yes.
Okay. No vetoes, so it seems to be all right. Okay. Now, it's not such an easy task to talk about complex issues like this one in 25 minutes, but I do my very best. I will not speak about Kraepelin only, although when I started in the history of psychiatry, actually I'm not a historian. I'm a psychiatrist, and I did study philosophy, and my field is the combination of clinical work and epistemology, if you want to say it like that. And I started in Munich, where I learned psychiatry with Professor Hippius. Many of you will know him, will have known him. And I started with work on Kraepelin, and later I extended that, of course, to Jaspers, and after moving to Zurich, extended it to Bleuler, as you can imagine, schizophrenia, dementia praecox. And a couple of years ago, it was a couple of decades ago, to be honest, I detected Arthur Kronfeld. Nobody knows him today, but I think he's a very intelligent, creative thinker in the 20s, 100 years ago. And nobody knows him because he, as a Jew, had to flee from the Nazis, and so his work was really kind of lost. And I tried to reactivate that because he is, in my view, one of the most productive thinkers when it comes to the issue of what is psychiatry and what kind of object do we deal with. And that's what I want to speak about in the next 25 minutes, beyond conceptual history, beyond shells. It means that it's not just the history of ideas. It's the idea has always been my aim in this field to think about applying the arguments of famous and creative thinkers in the past to what we do nowadays in psychiatry. And I think it's really necessary because psychiatry is a field, a medical field, whose identity is not too stable. I think we could agree on that. So I'll speak about three people, but the The issue will be what is psychiatry and what kind of concept of mental illness, if any, should we apply in the 21st century. So I want to start, as I did last year in London at our beautiful conference, which George Ikos organized together with others. Want to remind you of Roy Porter, the UK people will know him very well, the others maybe not, but I worked with him in the European Association of the History of Psychiatry, and it was a great time. And he, as you all know, he died much too early, 2002, and he wrote many good books, and this is a fantastic book if you want to get acquainted to the history of medicine, but not as a combination of specialties, but the view on medicine as part of society. And if there is any field in medicine which is really in the middle of psychiatry, then it's in the middle of society, sorry, then it's psychiatry. And so this book, The Greatest Benefit to Mankind, is really, it gave me a lot, and I really can recommend it. So, in memoria, Roy Porter. That's the agenda. I will start with some thoughts about the biopsychosocial model, which is part of every textbook of psychiatry in the last decades. And it is a good idea, but it is not as easy as it looks. And we have to move forward thinking about it and adapting it to modern thinking. It's not just fixed. That's the first issue. And then, for reasons of time, I will have a short look to the main ideas of Emil Kraepelin, Jaspers, and Kronfeld, and I hope to be able to show you that these approaches were time-bound, as every approach is, on ours too, but still really thought-provoking and fruitful. And when I just listened to the two Georges in the intro, both of them said big respect for Kraepelin and the founder of scientific psychiatry and many positive things. And I'm of that. I think that too, but I think it's also thought-provoking, and maybe there are issues where we do not agree. And I will try to give a little balance on that. And then the last point will be a suggestion, what kind of questions we could and we should ask nowadays if we want to move our field forward and stabilize its identity, if I may say so. Now, the biopsychosocial model, you will sure know where it comes from, and that is the original paper. The idea in itself may be much older than that paper, but the word biopsychosocial model and the explicit postulate that medicine needs something like that, multidimensional thinking, that was George Engel in 1977. So this is a couple of decades ago. And the title was not so psychiatry oriented, The Need for a New Medical Model, a Challenge for Biomedicine. And this is the model, you all know it. If we apply it to psychiatry, we have different factors, the biological factors, which is actually the brain function, but not only, of course. We have the psychological domain, which includes subjectivity, biography, history, what the person is we talk to in our hospital or in our practice. And we have the social factors. Where do the people live who get into a mental disorder? Do they have a job? Do they have relations, and so on? And if the combination of these three factors is not good, then a mental disorder in the middle can result. This sounds good and it sounds easy, and I would say it is good, but it's not easy. And you all know the debate on the biopsychosocial model, and this author, you will also know, Nasser Ghemi, already in 2009 wrote this editorial in the British Journal, quite a tough title, huh? The Rise and Fall of the Biopsychosocial Model. I wouldn't say it has fallen, but it's definitely not the euphoric atmosphere around that term as it was in the last decades of the 20th century. And why is that? It's our own responsibility, because if we would have used the biopsychosocial model in the sense George Engel suggested, if we really would have done that, which means a serious, respectful exchange between these three domains of biology, subjectivity, and the social domain, if we would have done that, then we would probably not have this debate now. That's what we should have done. But what often happens, not always, but often happens, is the negative version. It was just an addition of three perspectives, not so much a dialogue or a trialogue, but it was an addition. We have A, B, and C, and there was not so much of a serious exchange. When I look back to my years in psychiatry, which is now 45 years, I can't really say that's true what you see there on this slide. You have those schools who are not very much inclined to look over their narrow areas and talk to their colleagues who have a different opinion. That's the one point. It's not it has often not been a dialogue, but just a mere addition. And addition is not enough. Second point, and then the right side down there, we often saw, and we still see, that those three domains do not respect each other as different approaches to what we think mental illness is or mental disorders are, but they try to displace one by the other. Not only in one direction, not only the neuroscience people try to replace subjectivity, that's a commonplace critique. It has also, we have not the time for that, but there have also been examples the other way around. And so that's not the idea of George Engel, that one of these columns, these three columns, win and the others lose. That was not his idea, but that's what what often happened. So this has been criticized, the biopsychosocial model in the last two decades. And what has this to do with the famous older authors? I will now speak about those three: Emil Kraepelin, Jaspers, and Kronfeld. And for reasons of time, I will show you a small sector of, small but I hope central sector of the thinking of Kraepelin, the addition Jaspers brought, and the further addition Kronfeld brought. And I'm really not an expert on Lacan, really not. But what I know from Jacques Lacan is that this line from Kraepelin to Jaspers to Kronfeld is a line which gets closer to what Lacan tried to do in his perspective of psychiatry, especially as for the importance of language and what power language has. That was not a real big topic for Kraepelin. It was a topic for Jaspers, and it was a bigger topic for Kronfeld. So that is what George Christodoulou said in the beginning. Those two, in the first place, really contrasting figures like Kraepelin and Lacan, they work on the same topic, for example, on psychotic people. And so there must be some overlap. And if you look closely, there is some overlap, but they approach this field of mental illness from a completely different perspective. So let's start with Emil Kraepelin. It's a quite simple idea he developed in his 50 years in psychiatry, but it was a very strong idea. Strong, I mean, in an epistemological sense. His idea was that in psychiatry, we do have what he called natural disease entities, which is objective entities basically biological entities given by nature. That was his wording in many of his textbooks and publications. They are made by nature, not by us. Nature produces it, like nature produces somatic illnesses. That was his basic idea. He was, of course, not the first psychiatrist to think about that. That's clear. But he was the one, and that's why he became so influential on psychiatry. He was the one to transform this theoretical idea of natural disease entity to the very basic and concrete clinical diagnosis. As George mentioned, manic depressive illness versus dementia praecox. And his idea went further. He did not only say we do have natural disease entities, he said because these entities are produced by nature, it does not matter from which scientific perspective we approach them. If we do pathological anatomy, as his pupil Alois Alzheimer did, by the way, in Munich, if we use the pathological anatomy way, if we look for the etiology, which actually wasn't possible at that time, but from a theoretical point of view, or as Kraepelin himself did, if we look to the long-term cause clinically. No matter from which point we come, we will end up, if we do good research, we will end up with detecting what nature produces, which is natural disease entities. That's a very strong, epistemologically, very strong, philosophically speaking, a realistic position. These diseases do exist, whether we do research or not. And that is the modern version of the formulation, this book from 2011, carving nature at its joints. That's quite a famous phrase, to cut nature there where the joint is, not where we construct it. And that's exactly what Kraepelin would have thought in his time. Now Jaspers tried, you know, he came from psychiatry, went to philosophy, to existential philosophy. By the way, for personal reasons, because he had a lung disease and he was not able to do this hard work on the ward in Heidelberg at that time, and he had to leave this kind of work and then went to philosophy. That first psychology and then philosophy. And Jaspers had many very important ideas, as you all know, on psychiatry, but this was one of the most important ones. Psychiatric diagnosis and therapy, they are never only technical procedures. They necessarily are interpersonal acts. Nowadays, we would say they are dialogical acts. We speak with each other. It's not only measuring, it's also a dialogue. And two short quotes that you see, this was a world Kraepelin was not familiar with, and Kraepelin did not like too much. That was a kind of thinking, a world, not a world, a world, where Kraepelin would have said this goes back to the time in the early 19th century where psychiatry tended to be very speculative. You know, the Romantic era, Romantic psychiatry. Jaspers did not intend that, absolutely not, but Kraepelin would not have approved of sentences like this. This is Jaspers. In the world, I can move forward recognizing all sides. The world, the whole, I cannot recognize. It's no different with humanity. I never capture a person in their entirety once this person has become an object for me. That's for me, one of the most central sentences, statements by Jaspers. In the moment I try to capture the whole of my patient, to fix it by a concept, by whatever, then it's gone. Then I see something which may be correct, but I sure don't see the person in his or her entirety. And second sentence, there is no system of being human. in whatever wholeness we think we grasp humanity, it has slipped away from us. That's actually the same as the first sentence, but on a bigger scale. If we try to define humanity, conditio humana, condition humaine, we will not be successful if we try, because it slips. That would be interesting to discuss afterwards concerning the very strong position Lacan gave to the language. That's what when I read a little bit of Lacan, I admit, in preparing for today, and what I understood is that Lacan says language is not an object which we measure, what Kraepelin tried to do in his experiments, you know that. But Lacan said language is creating things. For example, our lives and our worldview and so on. And that would be my question later. How can we prevent Lacanian thinking in getting into the position that he can grasp everything in the patient by this by the language issue? Sorry, that was the wrong. Next slide. There it is. Now Kronfeld. I have only 5 minutes. Jesus. Arthur Kronfeld, I won't say much about. I won't say anything about the person for reasons of time. He was a contemporary of Kraepelin and Jaspers. Actually, he worked with Jaspers as assistant doctor in Heidelberg. They were two thriving young colleagues. Jaspers was a little bit older, 3 years older, and they were Konkurrenten. What's that in English? You know what I mean. They worked on the same top. Huh?
Competitors.
Competitors. Yeah, that's the word. I didn't grasp it. They were competitors, and Jaspers was much more famous, as you all know. He wrote his book General Psychopathology in 1913 when he was 30 years of age, and Kronfeld never reached that popularity in the scientific world. But these are a couple of books he wrote, and you see the left one, Das Wesen der psychiatrischen Erkenntnis, the essence of psychiatric knowledge, if you translate it. So the big topics: what is psychiatry? How can we do psychotherapy? And so I can't go into detail. His idea was the following, also quite easy, if you want to say. He said psychiatry, if psychiatry wants to be accepted in the medical faculty as a serious thing, and not just speculation, but also not just neurology, then psychiatry has to become a science with a specific quality, specific fundamental assumptions, specific methods and structure. And the most important word in this heading is specific. And that's what he meant by these kindly, now for our feeling, a little bit awkward terms. He said somatology, which is actually neurobiology, is a good thing. Absolutely no objections against that. But he said, if I look to the brain and to neurons, what they do when someone gets psychotic or depressed, then this is heterological, because it works with methods which do not come from the psyche, from the domain of subjectivity. And psychiatry as a science, as Kronfeld thought, should be autological. It should try to find the laws underlying the mental, the psychological field, and we should not, at least not in the beginning, use methods from somatic medicine to do research or to explain psychiatry. So what he said was not against neuroscience. That's really important to know. What he said is we need both, but we must not allow one side, the somatological side, or the other side to take over the other one. And that reminds us to this debate on the biopsychosocial model, where exactly that often happens, to try to take over or to make make superfluous the other perspective. That's what he did not want, and he said we need an ontological psychiatry which works with psychological methods, description, hermeneutics, understanding, and if that comes to a close, if that doesn't go any further in our research, then it's a good idea to use heterological methods. He called that ontology of psychiatry. The term isn't used anymore because I think Kronfeld was really the only one who used that. So, just one sentence: somatology suffers from a basic deficiency. It ignores the genuine structure of mental events. And the other one, there should be no explanation of psychopathological phenomena by somatic causation before they have fully been worked up ontologically, including their last ontologically irreducible genuine elements. Maybe we can discuss about this ontologically irreducible. This is a very strong thing, you know, ontologically speaking, but that was Kronfeld, very strong. Now, if we look at these three important figures, important thinkers, what questions do result for 21st century psychiatry? It's three levels, I think. And we really should do this, because if we don't, the identity of that medical field called psychiatry and psychotherapy will be even weaker than it is. As I witnessed it the last decades, it will become weaker if we do not ask these questions and try to find answers. Epistemological level, epistemological level, what do we do? What kind of science do we do? What is a mental illness? The anthropological level, what picture of man do we have? Menschenbild in German. And then number three, psychiatry, self-understanding, a little bit more precise here and related to the three authors. Kraepelinian topic, so to speak, what kind of object is a mental illness? Is it a good idea to reify mental illness? That's actually what Kraepelin did. His natural disease entities is nothing different from what we nowadays call reification. It's an object, it's a thing. Like any other somatic thing, we can also have the schizophrenia thing. That was kind of Kraepelin's approach, and we must discuss that. Is that true? And if not, what is it then? Second issue, we need a debate in our field. What image of humanity, in the sense of what a human, what conditio humana is behind our psychiatric work we do in the hospitals and we do in the practices. That is not often discussed nowadays. In my work now in the ethics committee, we have that topic, of course. But if I look to what clinics do, this is really, at least in my what I saw the last years, rather a rare topic. What do we think what a person is? And the last thing is related to that. Is there any kind of core, central topic, central issue of what we call psychiatry? Or not? Or is psychiatry just an accumulation of 20 methods nowadays, from genomics to big data to brain imaging to artificial intelligence, etc.? You all know that. Is that psychiatry a loose network of people and methods who try to find something out about psychosis? Or, as Kronfeld would have said, psychiatry has a core, and the core of psychiatry is the mental field, is the psyche, and what it means to be, what it feels like to be depressed, for example, or to hear voices, or to have formal thought disorders. Kronfeld's answer was, we must prevent a development where we lose this core of our field and gets get separated into 20 subdisciplines which have not any contact to each other. This would be the end of, to put it a little bit dramatically, it would be the end of psychiatry as a coherent medical field. That was Grunfeld's opinion. Now, this is my last slide. My personal resume from all this work on history of psychiatry is about that. Conceptual history, and this really relates to Lacan also, whom I don't know that well, but I'm pretty sure it's the case. To think about ideas in psychiatry is not just history for professors like me who do not work in the hospital anymore and have a lot of time. It is an essential tool for what we do every day with our patients. That's really one of my basic convictions concerning that field. And this is true from the historical perspective, but also from the perspectives of nowadays psychiatry, which is challenged in many ways. And as you all know, there are people also within psychiatry who say, well, the term psychiatry is 19th century. We don't need that anymore. We could switch to behavioral neuroscience. There are several options. The psychiatry is kind of outdated. And if we don't want to have that, if we want to defend a broad perspective of psychiatry, person-centered, you could call it, then linking our very famous and clever predecessors' ideas, Kraepelin, Jaspers, Bleuler, Grunfeld, with present-day debate shows really big potential. This is the main point, and I think we should do that, and we should talk to our young colleagues in the medical faculties and the young assistant doctors. We should talk to them about these issues. Finally, some advertising. That's a book I wrote about Grunfeld. It's in German, and that's the debate on the issue whether there's a core, an essence of psychiatry or not. And I think there should be one. That was his opinion in the 20th century, and it's also mine in the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention. This is Zurich when the weather is as nice as it is today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. That's a great lecture, of course. I apologize. I should have said to our participants that you can ask questions through the Q&A function. We will be monitoring those. We don't have time now really for the questions. Maybe we'll take all questions at the end.
Yeah.
But I would like to invite Tassos Dimopoulos, who is an NHS consultant psychiatrist in London and the immediate past chair of the philosophy special interest group at the college, just to give a response to this very thoughtful and thought-provoking talk by Paul. So, Tasso, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Paul, for this excellent presentation. It reminds me a lot of what I've been thinking for many years, that psychiatry is a never-ending project. It was always a project. Kraepelin had a project, Jaspers had a project, Lacan had a project. What means a project is like that something unfolds, and along the way you try to, you observe, you create your theoretical, your basis, you articulate something about the object of psychiatry. And as every project is destined at some point, you know, to experience limitations, opposition, change. Psychoanalysis had that. We had the decade of the brain. Nothing was really managed to fulfill like this kind of carving the, you know, the nature of these joints kind of thing. Like, so, and I will see your questions as not as something, an invitation is not something that we can really answer them in some form of definitive manner. And for those that know me, I'm particularly interested about how artificial intelligence is going to transform our field. And when I'm saying that, I'm not saying about like the solutions or the tools it may provide, but it will transform the way we think, the way we interact, the way knowledge, is exchanged. The power dynamics will change. Who knows and who doesn't? I had a patient yesterday. I was talking to him. He declined a home visit. I was talking to him over the phone. He has a significant physical health history. I mentioned about it, and he's in his 50s. And at some point, he was quite surprised that I knew so much about his physical health history, because for him, mental health is mental health, physical health is physical health. So there was the dualism there in the patient over the years trained to think mental health is something different. And then he asks me in some form of paranoid ways, is Palantir behind this? Like, is this my data, my personhood in a way? Like, is that there's only an integration of who am I, where there's Palantir, where it provides you data, etc. So you know about me things. And increasingly our lives exist not in this kind of interpersonal encounter, but is I don't know how it is in other countries, but let's say in the NHS, like the ratio of admin time, like time that you spend in some digital substrate, and a person like where you face the person is like maybe 1:9. Like you like 20% of your time may be seeing patients, 80% is just putting data into a system about someone, that then they are going to be interpreted, read, form impressions, understanding, all sorts of things. And to me, I'm thinking like these are questions that they need to stay open. The big danger in front of us is that critical thinking is going to be eviscerated by the use of artificial intelligence, because the way it is promoted is an uncritical, kind of adoption of it. And the evidence is quite clear already about how it erodes our ability to think critically about things. So that will actually, the kind of reflection that you're asking, that is in danger. My hope is that we can still, in 10, 20 years from now, we can still ask these questions, not answer them. But we're still in a place where we can actually ask these questions, because I'm concerned that this may not be the case. Going back is very helpful, but it has always to be within the context of the present and immediate future, because then it risks being experienced as something abstracted and complex, where people like simplification. And so, yeah, this is my thoughts about that from someone who cares about the future of the discipline, which is part of who am I, my professional identity. And yeah, that's a bit my comment about, and thank you again for your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tasso, for your very perceptive and thoughtful, as always, comments that I will ask Paul and our audience to keep in mind. I share your concerns, I have to say, very much, actually, the direction in which you're pointing us when thinking about the future. Now, I do admire Kraepelin greatly, but Niels Bohr, I think it was, who said that you can measure the greatness of a scientist not only by the years they set their field forward, but by the amount they held it back as well, by the years they held it back. And I think it's unfair to blame Kraepelin entirely for where we may have gone wrong. He's certainly not to blame for the neo-Kraepelinians who don't share in any way his the grand element of his thinking. But Lacan offers something very different. And I have to admit, I tried to understand Lacan 20, 30 years ago and didn't manage. I didn't have the help I needed. But I came back to him 2-3 years ago, and my thought was, wow, and psychiatry is sorely missing Lacan. And I actually think with his emphasis on language, he may be particularly relevant today with artificial intelligence, because he was very much part of a cybernetic discourse in the 1950s and later. It's a great pleasure now to author of 2 books, one on medicine and pain in Britain, Germany, and France in the 19th century, and the other one on biological psychiatry and cancer, and the Lacanian psychoanalyst. And his co-speaker, Darian Leader, who has a degree in the history of science and is also a Lacanian psychoanalyst. He's the author of 20 books, multiple articles in newspaper and journals, and he has been honored with a Mercier Chair at the University of Louvain for his contributions to psychoanalysis. So, Andrew and Darian, the floor is yours for the next half an hour, I think, or so. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, George. I'm going to speak first. Thank you very much for inviting us to speak today and for this wonderful theme of the webinar. Professor Hoff has invited contemporary psychiatrists to reflect further on 3 questions. What kind of object is a mental illness? What image of humanity or human nature do we apply? And what constitutes the essence or core identity of psychiatry? How can we stabilize the identity of the discipline? So to answer question 1, Kraepelin, as we've heard, favored natural disease entities, carving nature at its joints according to clinical picture, structural brain lesions, and etiology. For question 2, he tended to approach sick humans as observable objects of natural science. So their spatiotemporal location and their properties evolving over time would exhaust the scientific psychiatrist's knowledge. And the core identity of Kraepelinian psychiatry is knowledge of mental diseases, including their course over time. That's where the expertise lies. Well, Kraepelin's reification of mental disorders has been widely criticized for many decades, and it's too often led to clinicians treating the diagnosis rather than the person. And his approach to mentally ill persons as objects of study for psychiatrists and the epistemic injustice this entails is increasingly resisted. And the critique of Kraepelinian psychiatry has come not only from progressives outside the profession. In 2012, the NIMH in the USA, which funds a lot of psychiatric research there, announced that Kraepelinian diagnostic entities could no longer be used as the basis for further scientific research into mental health problems. Rather, said Thomas Insel, research should begin with particular mental symptoms or phenomena, such as, say, anhedonia. While opposing Kraepelin's diagnoses as entities, this actually reinforced and renewed his reductive view of sick humans and their symptoms as observable biological objects. Kraepelin's work, as developed by Mayer, as we've heard, led to some kind of adoption of the biopsychosocial approach to clinical adult psychiatry. And here, the mental disorder or disease entity, such as schizophrenia, is placed at the central intersection of biological, psychological, and social factors. And critics have increasingly called for something other than the mental disorder in this central position, perhaps the suffering person or patient. And such a move, while welcome, does require careful consideration of Professor Hoff's question 2. What do psychiatrists take a person to be? What image of humanity, the human, are we invoking here? Phenomenological psychiatrists such as Binswanger and von Gebsattel and Boss were heavily influenced by Heidegger's phenomenology. They saw the human condition, Dasein, as being in the process of becoming. And Heidegger saw having the word, i.e. language use, having numerous possibilities, some of which could be realized, and being temporalized through and through, both in terms of one's heritage and one's mortality. He took those three as defining features of the region of being called human. Now, Lacan, an intensely philosophical psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, was largely hostile to Kraepelinian psychiatry, although Darian will be discussing some surprising points of contact. And Lacan sought to place something other than a reified mental disorder at the center of clinical work. And Lacan was sympathetic to phenomenologists who sought to position the suffering, speaking person centrally. However, as a Freudian, he could not accept that the individual person seated before the clinician, or their ego, their lived experience, was his clinical target. Instead, in his earliest seminars of the 1950s, Lacan argued that the subject in question here is the subject of the unconscious, an unconscious structured like a language. And he said that the unconscious manifests itself clinically through the insistence of certain signifiers, certain words, which drive repetition and cause dreams and symptoms. And so then the clinician's task is all about reconstructing this unconscious material so as to place a record before the patient of the language fragments that have defined and determined their existence until now. Resistance and censorship on the side of either the clinician or the patient impede this task of interpretation of meaning. So for Lacan, the human is a subject full of possibilities, rather restricted by the language and culture they're born into. And in his later teaching too, Lacan emphasizes what he calls speaking being. So what I'm suggesting here is that Lacan cannot quite be appealed to by psychiatrists in support of a person-centered renewal of psychiatry, but he did teach the central importance of language and culture, including cultural prohibitions. And his answer to question 2 is that human nature is, quotes, speaking being in the process of becoming, close quotes. So now let's turn again to Professor Hoff's first question and Lacan's answer to it. Given this picture of humanity, what kind of object is a mental disorder? And Lacan's nosology changed over time from the 50s to the mid-1970s. In the 1950s, Lacan, again following the phenomenological psychopathologists, looked for mécanismes de délire, the generating disorders, the disorders of subjectivity that lay beneath and caused the baffling array of mental symptoms that we encounter. Rather than natural disease entities, Lacan offered detailed descriptive accounts of various clinical structures, as he called them, clinical structures. And in the 50s, he favored the neuroses, which he divided into hysteria and obsessional neurosis, the psychoses, and the perverse structure. He saw these as arising from Freudian defense mechanisms of repression, foreclosure, and disavowal, respectively. And his descriptions of the behavior of each of these in the specific context of the mid-century psychoanalytic consulting room were sensitive, novel, and compelling. So, for example, back in the 50s, he described how the hysteric seeks to place the analyst as a knowledgeable, specifically a sexually knowledgeable senior party, and then to evoke their desire, the desire of the other, through various strategies, only to enjoy leaving the perhaps now intrigued clinician in a condition of frustration and impotence. And for this reason, it's crucial to avoid just trying to help in work with hysterics. And Darren will be outlining the Lacanian approach to various psychotic clinical structures shortly. Well, it will hopefully be readily apparent how such accounts of disordered subjectivity differ from Kraepelin's observable natural disease entities. But do they really differ enough? By the early 1970s, psychoanalysis in Paris, along with psychiatry internationally, had come under sustained intellectual attack, notably from Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari. Lacan was now obliged to think deeply about how to move on from a categorical, prototypical classification of mental disorders, including his own clinical structures. And he also thought long and hard about what made one patient, one subject, different from the next, what it takes to really treat patients one by one. And his answer developed through a meditation on hymnology, the study of oneness, notably in seminars 9, 1961, and 19, 1971. His answer is that clinicians should be passionately committed to difference in itself prior to any specific content. Each patient should be approached afresh with no attempt to categorize based on previous cases. Now, such an approach relies on the extraordinary claim that henology precedes ontology. That is, that oneness is ontologically prior to being, or to put this perhaps more clearly, that sameness and difference are not features of what is, or judgments about what exists. Rather, unique identity, singularity, is prior to emergent being and prior to any properties, features, or content of what exists. And Lacan called this the unary trait, the unary trait. So in conclusion, I would like to propose that the essence or core identity of psychiatry should, in future, be to maintain a passion for difference in itself, an openness to encounter with radical alterity, rather than being an expert on certain differences. And this, I think, is compatible with championing universal human rights and celebrating diversity, because oneness is polysemic and includes gathering unity, universal human rights, as well as uniqueness and singularity. And Kraepelin's psychiatry, I think, struggled to support either human rights or the celebration of diversity. And I think that's one of the things that some contemporary psychiatrists are struggling with, because they're seeing the emphasis on diversity, which some right-wing commentators are calling a new theology. They're seeing that as a kind of external imposition on the real business of psychiatry. Anyway, defining psychiatry in this way requires a closer relationship with psychoanalysis and a renewal of interest in high-quality idiographic research. Thank you for your attention. I'll pass over to Darian.
Many thanks, Andrew, and many thanks to the two Georges for organising and hosting this evening's event. So I'll go straight into the topic. Lacan and Kraepelin are almost always seen, certainly in analytic circles, as opposing ends of a spectrum, with Kraepelin representing a kind of biological essentialism with diagnostic classification based on observable symptomology, biochemical assumptions and, crucially, a rigid prognostic template, and Lacan representing a language-based model with few prognostic assumptions. Lacanian work tends to be seen as working against Kraepelinian-based psychiatry, that of most of the DSMs, which are taken to privilege symptom-based models. Historians, however, have shown how Kraepelin's work is much more complex than these standard summaries, and how his diagnostic templates changed over time. Distinctions he was famous for were heavily qualified in later work, especially in the early 1920s, and models ascribed to him, such as a mood-based conception of manic depression, shown to be more or less absent in his Lehrbuchs. Even his emphasis on prognosis was softened in later work, despite his enduring interest in the question of the sequences to be found in psychosis, an interest certainly shared by Lacan and his own psychiatric teachers. Less known, perhaps, is the interest Lacan and Kraepelin also shared in the question of language. For years, Kraepelin collected samples of dream speech recorded at his own bedside, and he compared these with the neologisms found in dementia praecox and with prevailing conceptions at the time on the neurology of the aphasias. He explored speech fragments that seemed to show semantic or syntactic deviance. He was less interested in the others, found most often in hypnagogic or hypnopompic states. And this is where there's a convergence, perhaps, in the interest of both Kraepelin and Lacan in language. Classical late 19th century language theory distinguished between three basic functions of language: the referential, the emotive, and the conative. The referential was about how language refers to objects and meanings. The conative referred to how we address the other, questioning, persuading, commanding. And the emotive was about how our words express our emotions and feelings. This is I'm summarizing in a very schematic way. But crucially, these functions are hardly exhaustive. What they miss out is arguably our very first experience of language, which is that of being spoken to and about. An infant's earliest experience, after all, consists of being addressed. Parents talk to them, ask them questions, tell them what to do, comment on their actions. We can call this the interpellative dimension of language, how speech aims at us. And it's perhaps clearest in adult life in two situations. In the experience of some schizophrenic subjects who feel that the world is addressing them, yet without knowing what the meaning of this meaning is, and in the experience of falling asleep and waking up, exactly where Kraepelin found his examples of dream speech. The verbal fragments we so often experience at these moments often have an acute sense of meaningfulness. They mean something, but we don't know what they mean. And we also so often feel that they're very important, that they're directed to us. They have a kind of personal meaning. To take an example from Kraepelin himself, bound hand and foot, all the patients can be classified to the night stool law. Now, he gave his own interpretation of it. In a way, it doesn't make too much sense, but it's clear that it does mean something perhaps of great importance, and that it's relevant to the person. But the assignment of meaning usually stops there. It's very difficult to actually then figure out what exactly the meaning of these odd fragments is. And this opens up the broader question of how language impacts the human subject from birth. Speech, for Lacan, is not a neutral element in the child's world, and just as it can soothe and heal, it can threaten and disorient. The very fact that the infant has no way to defend against the experience of being spoken to may give it a potentially invasive quality, And we can see many of the phenomena of childhood as treatments of this, for example, crib speech. Now, Lacan emphasized both this invasive aspect of speech and the effects of language in shaping the child's direction in life, as Andrew pointed out. Language here is first a battery of symbolic operations, with its mechanisms not really that different from those catalogued by Freud and Kraepelin found in the aphasias. Symbolic structures operate here like codes, transcending consciousness, yet structuring our actions and thought processes. We can see this clearly in examples of intergenerational trauma, where representations of events from before someone's birth can impact them in their own life, filtered down through what the child has heard the parents say or in between the lines. But Lacan's thesis was actually much, much stronger than this. It wasn't just about the impact of particular word, the meaning of particular words and events in the past. He thought that there was an impact of the actual structure of language, which produces what he called, taking up a common term from existentialism, an alienation, dividing human subjectivity and forcing us into the straits of the linguistic world, a process that obviously has both benefits and losses. Now, as a counterpoint to the emphasis on alienation, Lacan gave an important place also to what wasn't language, contrasting alienation with what he called separation, which for him meant our separation from language, which can take a variety of forms. The more we feel constrained in language, the more we feel it's failing to express what we might mean to say, the more we feel that it's imposing itself on us, determining us, shaping our lives, we separate from it in transitory moments, often to points of bodily innovation, eating or drinking to excess, narcotics, self-harm, obvious examples. So there's a movement for Lacan between alienation in language and separation from language. And this is where the theory can help us to illuminate some aspects of diagnostic structures, the kind of structures that, of course, Kraepelin was so interested in. Some forms of psychosis seem to show a difficulty in separating from language. Language means too much, and elements in the external world are experienced as emitting meaning. Posters, street signs, remarks overheard, all become enigmatic, embodying a meaning that the person knows concerns them, yet doesn't understand what it means. Everything means something, and the weight of meaning is acutely felt. From a Lacanian perspective, the person here is in alienation, but with no means to access separation. Everything in the world is speaking to them, and they have to try and find a way to mute or silence this continuously speaking world and find a compass within it. This is characteristic of the schizophrenias, and delusional constructions here are generally more transitory, as is well known, as if the person is left suspended, grappling with the problem of how to ascribe meaning. This is in contrast for Lacan with paranoia, where meaning is much more fixed and pinned down through delusions. A well-constructed delusion fixes meaning, rendering meaning closed rather than open, and makes usually a neat separation between the self and the other. The self is innocent, the other is guilty, for example. Or in delusional melancholia, and no amount of persuasion can convince them otherwise. Now note how these
we are losing you, Darian. You're going staccato. I'm sorry about this interruption. I'm anticipating
other variables. Two other variables are also relevant here. Distance, and what Lacan calls jouissance, but I'm going to call it morbid agency because I think that's simpler. Schizophrenic subjects often describe their day-to-day efforts to find their right distance from other people, which can range from literal geographic distance to a psychical distance, where the person might believe that parts of their body are in fact parts of another person. Distance is a perpetual difficulty, as the other can be experienced as too close or too distant, sometimes abandoning them and sometimes invading them. Life might involve multiple efforts to create the right distance from others, ranging from so-called negativism to even the practice of therapy, which provides an artificial frame that regulates interactions with the other. In paranoia, distance is easier to regulate as delusion gives it a structure. Self and other are not the same, as the other doesn't intrude into the self, as it does in schizophrenia. In melancholia, distance is also central, but this time by being collapsed. There is no distance between self and other, as the other has been literally folded into the person's self-image. Someone whose father was a convicted thief accuses themselves of larceny, and nothing can shake this self-accusation, just as the bereaved melancholic, rather than mourn the dead, often dies with them. The third variable, what Lacan calls jouissance and we'll call morbid agency, echoes these distinctions. In schizophrenia, the other is often intrusive and malign, yet the same can be said about the person's body, as hypochondriacal phenomenon suggest. The person must fight to block the invasive experience of the outside coming in, creating barriers and boundaries. In paranoia, the morbid agency is defined as the persecutor and thus given a place and very often a name. And in melancholia, morbid agency engulfs the person's self-image as they continually blame and accuse themselves. So these variables, meaning, distance, and morbid agency, are helpful not just in framing diagnostic structures, but also in responding clinically. And here I think we rejoin Andrew and Paul's questions about the direction, perhaps, or the meaning even, of psychiatry. If someone wraps themselves up, say, in cling film, this may be an attempt at self-cure to create a bodily boundary where they feel most threatened, perhaps after an experience of their body dissolving or being shattered. If we recognize the usefulness of the idea of alienation, this might also shed light on some of the neurodevelopmental disorders, where it seems as if rather than a difficulty in separating from language, it is as if the hook of language has not actually caught. There is no entry into alienation, and there's an extreme sensitivity to it. Children and adults then invent strategies that deal with the experience of being addressed, of being interpolated, often involving the use of proxies. Acknowledging with Lacan that psychosis involves a work of trying to fix meaning, to create distance, and to localize morbid agency has many consequences. It means that phenomena of psychosis can be seen as efforts to solve these problems, that we see psychosis as a problem-solving effort rather than as pathological forms in themselves. This was the split recognized by Bleuler, which I think Lacan and Freud were both very faithful to, between the primary and secondary phenomena of psychosis, often confused with Schneider's first and second rank symptoms. In the primary phenomena, you might include the feeling of the body collapsing or shattering into pieces. By the secondary ones, it could involve a delusional construction or bodily practices like wrapping the body in cling film. This means that the psychotic person's constructions must be respected, encouraged, and worked with rather than excised or ignored once we recognize that distinction between primary and secondary phenomena. It means that what is often seen as madness may in fact be the person's attempt to treat their madness, and that what is taken to be pathological is in fact part of a larger restructuring process that we might try to support. Projects of rehabilitation and reintegration can be relativized in that way, and we can learn from the psychotic subject, respecting the strategies that they've put into place to find a degree of stabilization and equilibrium. To conclude, the clinician, the therapist, is not the expert here, but can allow themselves to be instructed by the psychotic person in a long and open-ended dialogical process, offering a space free, ideally, of the dominant values of efficiency and achievement so often endorsed by the contemporary world. Rather than offering any kind of normative solution, we might hope to encourage, in contrast, the person's own idiosyncratic solutions, as Andrew just emphasized, regardless of whether these are deemed socially useful or redundant, superficially successful or unsuccessful. What matters is how the subject can use the resources of their own psychosis to find a bearable way of life. So that again might be a response to the question of the meaning and the direction of work with psychosis. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Darian, for your incredibly rich and constructive contributions. There is a lot in what you both have said, as well as Paul. And I'd like to say here that this Speculative Psychiatry group have kindly offered to host a video of today's sessions in their collection on YouTube. So it's the Speculative Psychiatry group website, which has an excellent collection of videos. So look it up. I see there is a question which we will come to by John Mason, which I think is addressed to all three speakers. But before that, I'd like to invite Michelle Bodbol, who is Emeritus Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry in Brest, and a psychoanalyst who is now in private practice in Paris. He's a psychoanalyst also from a different perspective. So, Michelle, we look forward to hearing from you, your response.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this excellent meeting and very thought-provoking presentations, clear and rich, of course, too rich for me to address all the very interesting questions it raised, both what Paul Hoff said and what Andrew and Darian showed us. But focusing on the two last presentations, I think it was very interesting to show us how Lacanianism, you're right, I'm not a Lacanian, in spite of the fact that I'm a French psychiatrist and even a psychoanalyst. It may be forgotten outside of France that there are such a thing in France of non-Lacanian psychoanalysts. So to show us how Lacanianism emerged and how it transformed psychoanalytic clinical practice in psychiatry in a way that is not unlike that of Sigmund Freud, who because like Sigmund Freud, Lacan starts from a position largely inspired by the one he will then oppose. And you show that Lacan was first somehow influenced by Emil Kraepelin and his method supporting on nosography the description of a disorder and their mechanism. This is something you show very well, Andrew, when you explain that he uses at the beginning the same type of method, even if the nosography he is using is different from the one Kraepelin proposed. He did the same thing without calling into question the psychiatric method introduced by Kraepelin, to the point that some of Lacan's brightest opponents, and among them those who you really mentioned, but also some very bright psychoanalysts of those who remained in the EAPE society, psychoanalytic society, some of them accused Jacques Lacan of turning psychotic patient into disabled of the foreclosure of the name of the father. That is the paternal metaphor, which is not, of course, only the dysfunctional father. It is then, this is the first step in Lacan, but the one which made him very famous at that time around the idea that foreclosure of the name of father was really the metaphor of what was causing the psychosis. So then his focus on language and desire put decisively the focus on subjectivity. And even if Darren showed us, in this field also, the Lacan's consideration to language is not far from what, at this time, Kraepelin did with his interest of language, psychotic language. So here, I think, begins what also was so important and is still very important in many fields, I have to say, outside of psychiatry most of the time now in France, which is, of course, what he calls himself the subject of unconscious, something that distinguishes the new object of his science from Kraepelin's biopsychosocial patient and from the person of the phenomenologist. You said, Andrew, something clearly that I would like to question in closing this remark. You say that you don't think that Lacan can be appealed to be psychiatrist in support of person-centered renewal of psychiatry. And that's true that most of Lacanian in France too wouldn't say that it could be appealed for this support. And the reason you give for this impossibility lies for you in the central importance that Lacan gives to language and culture in his conception of human nature. Human nature is a speaking being, le par-l'être, in the process of becoming. I wonder, does giving such a central place to language and culture mean giving them the whole place in defining the person and his becoming to such a level that considering the human being as a subject of the unconscious would prevent them, the human beings, from being as well person in the phenomenological sense of the term? Being myself neither a philosopher nor a phenomenologist, but only a psychiatrist who sees person-centeredness as an opportunity to integrate the subjectivity, something I think I understood Arthur Cronsfeld would have been happy to see as an attempt, at least, of both patients, subjectivity of both patients and therapists, because the real problem we are facing now is that therapists will completely refuse, reject anything that has to do with subjectivity in the way of considering psychiatric patients. So, and this is very serious. Into today clinical practice, we have to find something. And for me, I do not understand why this would be considered incompatible with the central role Lacan finally gave to difference, because of course, as you said, he did that. But, and also to what you, Andrew, said at the end of your presentation, precedence on singularity over ontological ontology. I will be happy to know your Lacanian opinion on this clinical issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michel. You've truly gone to what I think is at the heart of concerns, really, that Paul raised, in fact, about
Yes.
what is at the heart, and which both Andrew and Darian spoke so eloquently and so richly about. I would like to let them rest on that. We really need a full day to address the questions that arise today, rather than feel compelled to answer you. I'm mindful of our ERA support, the staff that are working late. Don't want to keep them too late. And I do want to involve our audience. We do have a question. So please hold on to Michel's question, which I really do think is central. And maybe we'll come to it back after we've tried to address a rather cryptic question posed by John Mason, if I can read it. It says, quote, diagnosis, the extension of people who make diagnosis, unquote. If so, how can psychiatrists again treat people rather than diagnosis? So we come back again, I think, to the question of person, the relationship with a psychiatrist, and the role of the psychiatrist. I don't know who might want to answer. If you say, if anyone wants to answer that, say, unmute and tell me you want to answer, and the floor is yours. Otherwise, I will give the floor to one of the speakers.
Yeah.
Go on. Yeah.
I don't know whether I can answer this difficult question, but I have some ideas. I mean, if you regard diagnosis as the extension of people who make them, then this would be the exact opposite of a dialogue. This would more or less be kind of a photographic apparatus which takes pictures, just one way. And if you see diagnosis as that, as a monologue, then you will. This is not the picture of psychiatry I had in mind, and surely not what Jaspers had in mind. Diagnosis has to be a dialogue, and if we do understand diagnosis as checkboxes, as some people do, you know, ICD-9, ICD-10 and 11, if you have those checkboxes, and you think that by checking them, you come close to the patient, or even you understand the patient, or you see the illness, then this is not what diagnosis is. So the answer would be yes, indeed, if diagnosis is defined as a project which the diagnostician is the master, and he doesn't need, or he or she doesn't need anything else apart from a patient uttering a couple of words, then yes, then he or she, the therapist, would not treat the patient but the diagnosis. But the other way around, if you see diagnosis as a dialogical process, via language, of course, then it could be different. Then diagnosis could be the start of therapy, but only then. That would be my idea on that.
Thank you. Any final comments, Andrew or Darian, before I hand over to our colleagues? You're not tempted to answer Michel's question, really. Very fair question, very central question.
I would like to just check that I've understood Michel's question, which is, I think he's saying, am I sure I really want to say that Lacan's not the answer if we're looking to move towards a person-centered version of psychiatry? How sure am I of this rather inhuman remark that I'm attributing to Lacan? And I think it's not quite like that. I mean, especially, I mean, I'm talking, what I'm trying to suggest is that it has to be a well understood and nuanced version of person-centered that we're going to place there, which pays attention to Lacan's rather peculiar idea about the difference between a subject and an ego, which would take a long time to explicate, but is very well covered in Seminar 2. He went to a great deal of trouble to distinguish between the lived experience that phenomenologists are interested in and the question of unconscious subjectivity, which is much more to do with the insistence of signifiers. So that's his kind of 1954 way of saying person-centered, but language to the fore. And then by the time of the later work, I think it's really interesting, because I think by then he's really saying something quite radical, which Gilles Deleuze picked up in his fantastic book, Difference and Repetition, which is this concept of difference in itself, which again would take a long time to explicate. But basically we get to the idea of difference without content and difference prior to content. And that's quite strange. I mean, that's not about persons sitting in front of you. It's more about being a standard bearer for difference in itself and singularity, and not making judgments between different types of people or different types of content, or expecting certain types of content to turn up. So if it is person-centered, it's an unusual person-centered perspective that puts an emphasis on idiosyncrasy, singularity, and sometimes on the unconscious, structured like a language. So I guess if that's what if we're happy with that as person-centered, fine. But that's how I'd try to answer. That's how I'd try to answer.
Yeah, it's a very good answer for me.
Thank you. Great answer, really great answer. I'm going to hand over now first to Nikos Christodoulou, who is professor of psychiatry in the University of Thessaly and a member of the executive of the Hellenic Psychiatric Association. And then he can hand over to Professor Dušica Lečić-Stovševski, who is the chair of the section of psychiatry and mental health in EAPE and a member of the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences. So, Nikos, over to you first.
Thanks very much. Thank you, George. And thank you for organizing this wonderful session today, which I'm enjoying immensely. I am vastly underqualified to make any important statements in all this. I think we've heard a lot of very, very deep and interesting thoughts from the panelists today. All I'm going to suggest is that there is a bit of a trap in thinking that approaching the question of Lacan versus Kraepelin looks almost like a compare and contrast exercise, which is again a bit of a logical trap. The reason why I consider it to be a trap is because there is a tendency of thinking that there is an epistemological split between those two approaches, the interpretive approach of Lacan versus the positivist approach of Kraepelin. And that is something that one can see in many of the aspects that they have explored separately. Language, classification, the cases of psychosis, and so on and so forth. In essence, that tendency of looking at this as a competition of different approaches is expressed in today's psychiatry in all the divides that we see in our everyday practice between biological psychiatry and psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytical approaches. In all those things that divide us more than unite us in our world of psychiatry. In essence, it is a trap because those two approaches are incommensurable. They're paradigms which are incommensurable. And there is value in combining those approaches as opposed to looking at them in a comparative way. And I noted down that this was a pattern that was expressed both by Paul Hoff's position, as well as Tasso's position, as well as Andrew's as well. So Paul did point out that those two approaches are different and suggested that there is value in taking into account the conceptual history of psychiatry, and that this is an essential tool for understanding psychiatry. Tassos then went on to say that there is value in asking questions. Again, both of them did not look at this question as a compare and contrast exercise. They approached it as an opportunity to ask questions and to look at those very different approaches, not in isolation, but in collaboration. And Andrew Hotchkiss went on to say that, and I'm quoting here, we need to maintain a passion for difference rather than being expert in different fields. I like that a lot, because then what we are called upon here is not to resist the temptation to compare and contrast, to resist the temptation of looking at those approaches in a competitive way, but to become sort of generalists in psychiatry and specializing in generalism, which gives us the advantage of incorporating all those approaches into our clinical practice, which is something that Michel Botbol also expressed in his thesis earlier. So that's the point I made, and again, I'm no expert here, but I did figure that there is a pattern which was common between the panelists, and that pattern is to ask more questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nico. I call it negative dialectics, but that's another long lecture. Dussika, please, can you help us bring today's event to an end?
Thank you very much, George. I would like at the beginning to thank you for diligently organizing this very important meeting, and I also want to thank all the speakers, being sure that you all, and not you all, but the audience enjoyed your speeches as I did. In conclusions, I would like to say a few personal views about Kraepelin and Lacan, and now I would like to see my slides.
Mr. Liakos, yeah, thank you.
I'm not an expert, but I will try. I can see them.
You have to go to slideshow.
Yes.
We
Okay.
we can see your screen there. That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So I don't know much about Lacan, but a year ago I read a book, biography of his life written by Elizabeth Rudinescu, historian and psychoanalyst, which has almost 600 pages. And in that book, Rudinescu described Lacan as a controversial figure of the best kind, with many perplexing and unorthodox ideas and approach to psychotherapy. His sessions, as all Lacanians know, were very far from what Freud proposed. Sometimes they were very brief, 15 minutes or even shorter. Although I have learned that we as therapists should be more free, as Lacan was saying, I'm still faithful to Freud and my sessions, my dialogue with patients, and they last 15 minutes as he recommended. And the next slide, I don't know how to, next slide, yes. Kraepelin is of course much closer to me, and since my psychiatric Weltanschauung centers on personality and personality disorders, I would say a few words about his concept and the classification of personality disorders. I think there is no psychiatrist nor medical student who have not heard about his great name, and he gave key contributions to classification systems. He categorized psychopathic personality into types: born criminal, weak-willed, pathological liars, swindlers, and pseudo-querulants. And we can see that some of these, for instance, born criminal, disocial personality as they are today called, irresolute, weak-willed as schizoid perhaps, pathological liars as histrionic, etc. Nowadays, there are thoughts that we live in psychiatry in neo-Kraepelian era. Modern systems, DSM-3 through DSM-5 and ICD-10 and 11 are considered neo-Kraepelinian, as they maintain his emphasis on descriptive psychopathology, clinical utility, and distinction between psychosis and mood disorders. What is his contribution, and what is neo-Kraepelinian era? Kraepelin pointed out importance of longitudinal perspective, which is a central principle to both ICD-11 and DSM-5 in diagnosing personality disorders. He also pointed out dimensionality and stability, recognizing that personality disorders exist on a continuum of severity, exactly which is now introduced into the ICD-11. And I personally was involved in creating ICD-11 classification of personality disorders, being a member of WHO working group for classification of personality disorders. So his views influenced the shift towards dimensional trait models in both systems, both DSM-5 and ICD-11. Also, he thought that clinical observation is very important, and he advocated for diagnosing based on the entire pattern of symptoms in the context of the patient's life, which is echoed in the functional impairment focused in ICD-11 and the alternative model for personality disorders, AMPD in DSM-5. And that would be all that I wanted to say, the closing remarks. Thanking you very much again, George, for inviting me, and thanking you for your attention.
Thank you, Duška. And thank you to everyone. It's been an honor for me to chair such really excellent contributions, and hope people will take your thoughts away, think further, and develop their practice. as they see fit. So this is the end. Thank you very much. And thank you to ERA for supporting us.